Next up, we've got Helen Barber, a transfusion practitioner from Leeds. She's going to talk to us about the implementation of BloodTrack at Leeds, which particularly the TX part of it, which they did during the pandemic. Helen is a nurse by background from urgent care and accident and emergency. She's been a TP for 3 years now. And I'll hand over to you, Helen.
Oh, thank you very much, Rachel, for that introduction. I know that we have worked on BloodTrack Tx, so some of what I'm going to obviously mention is something that you'll remember vividly 3 years ago. Hello to everybody, and thank you for asking me to talk about the implementation of BloodTrack Tx into Leeds. Now, so I'm going to talk about it from a clinical perspective. As Rachel quite rightly said, I'm a nurse by background. Obviously, I can't really discuss what's happened as regards the lab. I have worked very closely, obviously, with my lab colleagues, and they have obviously gone through everything that Nick Polly has just mentioned, obviously, which is a very, very big, obviously, piece of work as well. But I think to start off with, it is teamwork, and you have to work well as a team in order to implement it. So I'm hoping this is going to work. Yeah. So, all right, to start off with, I'm going to discuss the background to implementation, how we gathered our information, the project team and how they came about, the training work stream that I led, and where we are today. So the whole concept of electronic transfusion management is exciting, and we wanted it obviously in Leeds. We wanted to be all singing, all dancing, leading the way and making it safer for our patients and staff. I think in Leeds we wanted what was best for staff and for our patients. So back in 2005, Haemonetics BloodTrack Autofate was introduced into the lab and the clinical area. This helped the transfusion practitioners enormously to be able to audit Autofate and ensure traceability for approximately 2,300 blood components given monthly in the trust. The transfusion practitioner team did not want to stop there and wanted to introduce the whole package of the electronic BloodTrack system. From this, 2 business cases were presented over the next 10 years. The trust would not commit and said no, that they would not introduce it. But in 2018, Leeds had an MHRA inspection, something we are all really familiar with and obviously enjoy. They highlighted that we did not have a risk assessment in the trust to mitigate the wrong blood being given to a patient. Blood could be given on 1 sample. Leeds did not have the 2-sample rule, and risk showed that we had to implement something to make it safer. We had wrong blood in tubes at the time that were highlighted. Luckily, we had not had an incompatible blood transfusion. Everyone in Leeds wanted a safer transfusion system that assured samples were taken and labelled safely. And at the time, we couldn't show that. So this meant that we could not afford not to implement the 2-sample rule. This discussion was taking place when I started as a transfusion practitioner. It was quickly realised that an electronic blood tracking system would mitigate the 2-sample rule being implemented in the trust. I spoke to the Assistant Chief Operating Officer and asked what was happening. He said that we were going to buy BloodTrack Tx and not to go ahead with the 2-sample rule. The existing BloodTrack would be built on with BloodTrack Tx, sampling, administration and haemobanks. So previous business cases were used to procure the electronic BloodTrack system, and it was bought for £1.4 million. And this bought us 200 PDAs and printers, 19 haemobanks for use across all 5 sites, training module on BloodTrack, Band 7 TP post to implement and maintain the system, videos to aid training, 20 wristband printers and cartridges, and we bought more than any other hospital in the UK. I put myself forward to be training lead. I had never run a project on this scale before, so I had a lot to learn. I didn't even know how it worked and had never seen it in action. That was soon to be rectified. So in late 2019, when there were no restrictions to travelling and no Microsoft Teams, we went on a road trip. And that included me and Rachel Allen, who is obviously chairing the afternoon session. I took a road trip to Wiston, Exeter and London to see the electronic BloodTrack system in use and speak to transfusion practitioners and lab managers who had implemented the system. I went with a quality manager and a lab lead. We wanted to know what it looked like, how it worked, hints and tips to introduction, what worked, what didn't. We got to meet other transfusion practitioners and lab leads and took contact details. We also had nice food and saw some nice cities. Whilst doing this, we were working in the background to get the project commenced. And as Nick Polly said, all right, you need a really highly effective project team. We set up project teams very early on. A project lead to bring it all together was not chosen early enough. We wanted someone solely for the project, and we mentioned this very, very early on, but it wasn't acted on, and they were too slow to sort it. The lead for Blood Bank ended up taking the role on as well as doing their own job. As you can imagine, this was a very big task. All right, so they did a really good job, having said that. We had a lab, IT and training work streams with leads for each. IT were not involved in the initial business case. And again, Nick Polly mentioned, and I think Julie Stays mentioned this as well this morning, that IT are paramount in the project. They have to be included early on. And this was a big mistake. They were included after the business case was put in, and that did not help our getting things started effectively. It meant a delay in implementing the system. For those who have implemented BloodTrack, they will know that it is a massive job for IT, all right, to be involved in. We did eventually get them on board, but not really soon enough. We also had an assurance board, which consisted of pathology management, the assistant CEO, IT, communications and blood bank seniors. And they met every month for updates and decision making. TPs were not invited, and we had to go through our project lead if we wanted anything mentioning or solving. This was not ideal, as the project lead could not give definitive answers, so they took longer to solve. So, all right, it was full steam ahead. We'd sat down, realised that we needed to get on, and wondered where we were going to scope first. So after having collected the data from all the areas who took samples and administered blood, it was agreed that we would pilot the system on one of the ICUs, and they were really, really keen to try it. We scoped this area and spoke to staff, including the doctors and clinical educators, and put a plan in place. We were going to base ourselves there for 4 weeks, working 12-hour days, to include all shifts and introduce sampling, administration and collecting. They already had a part-functioning hemobank, which we would obviously build on. We would then evaluate, and we were all set to go. So, to reflect on the background, procurement and project team and the initial training. So what went well? We'd actually procured £1.4 million of funding approved to buy what we needed. We employed a whole-time band 7 TP as training lead. Equipment was delivered and configured by IT, and we had training from Zebra on PDAs and the printers. A working hemobank was set up for training in the lab. TPs networked with ICU staff, including matrons, clinical educators, assessors and medics. The project teams were working well. Communication was ready to go out to the trust. So what could we have done better? On hindsight, all right, our focus group consisted of a transfusion practitioner, a quality manager and a lab manager. And I think there's something that Julie Staves mentioned in the first, obviously, presentation. And she said that clinical area needs to be involved as well. Would it have been good to take somebody actually from the clinical area with us on our road trip so they could actually see it working and in action? The business case used was an old one that had been submitted years earlier. So how up to date was it as regards how much equipment we needed? And it was very questionable about having 19 hemobanks and if we had enough blood to fill them. We employed another band 7 transfusion practitioner from the business case. Early on, all right, we questioned having the band 7 money used as a project lead or having it as a IT lead for BloodTrack in the laboratory because we didn't have IT support at that time. But we weren't listened to. We did actually get another Band 7 transfusion practitioner, obviously, which has enhanced our group. Also, what works in one hospital doesn't always work in another. A small hospital can control staff easier than a larger hospital. We quickly realised that a lot of staff taking samples had no evidence that they had the CHS132, which is the competence for obtaining the blood sample. So we needed to incorporate this in the training as well and evidence this. We're all ready to go, and the country suffered its first COVID lockdown. It was an unknown entity. ICU was full of COVID patients isolating. BloodTrack Tx was no longer a priority. We had to change our plans. We could no longer implement in ICU. Could we still continue with the project? We were then told that we could only implement sampling, which was a big come down from implementing it all. The LIMS couldn't support admin and the hemobanks unless we had an upgrade. This meant more money, and was it worth it when we were getting a new LIMS the following year? We are getting a new LIMS, and the new LIMS is this year now, obviously because of COVID that had been put on hold. Despite COVID, the trust still wanted us to implement sampling. We just had to be smarter and readdress all that we had planned. We had to rapidly rethink our strategy. We had to look at different ways of learning to what we had anticipated for users. We developed a PowerPoint for ESR for all users to complete prior to training. We called in a few favours from mandated training to get this system set up. The old adage, make friends, not enemies, was never more apparent in COVID for getting things done as everyone wanted a slice of everything. We worked with Red Training to develop our own videos, so all staff had an idea of how it worked prior to implementation. We planned to scope each area by meeting the ward managers. We had a scoping list to complete, so we had all the info we needed prior to training. We still didn't know if we could train face to face. We reiterated that this was must, as we had to maintain safety by completing a competency for each member of staff. The training team met fortnightly prior to COVID. Suddenly we had to meet on Teams. This was another big learning curve. Communication went out to the heads of nursing, the matrons, ward managers, clinical educators, and the doctors. Communication went out in the form of screensavers, bulletins, and on the communication from the chief executive at the start of the week. We started scoping the areas we were going to implement first. We also needed extra staff. There wasn't enough transfusion practitioners in order to be able to implement it to the whole trust. So we managed to get staff on the back of COVID, as so many retired nurses had volunteered their services and they were not needed. We employed 3 nurses from this bank and 1 from an agency. Eventually, the trust gave us the go-ahead to train face to face. We became experts on cleaning and PPE, as you could imagine. So in July, we planned to pilot in the Haematology Day unit. They took a lot of samples daily. We thought it was the ideal choice, seeing as they also worked in daytime hours. They completed the video and PowerPoint prior to training, which meant we were in the clinical area training for a shorter amount of time. As soon as they were trained, they could start using the PDA and printer for sampling, as we had got it all set up on the unit. We were available for 2 weeks while they used the system. On the unit itself to start off with, then on the end of the phone, as they didn't need us there all the time. After 2 weeks, we evaluated. So what went well? We had scoped and were well prepared. They picked it up easily and found it easy to use. Using all the COVID drills, we managed face to face. They loved it. There were less rejections from the lab. The training tools were well evaluated by the ward team. What we learned. Originally, and somebody asked this question with Julie Staves earlier about scanning whilst we were obviously taking the blood or after taking the blood. We wanted the process to be seamless so that you identified your patient with the scanner, you then took the blood, and then you scanned the wristband, and then you printed the label off, should I say. But what happened was it kept timing out, and especially on the haematology unit where patients were sometimes difficult to cannulate and also had lines in which had to be cleaned. So, we quickly had to rethink that. And I think this is what everybody else does as well, in that you identify your patient physically first, and then you take your sample, and then you print the label off from the system. We found that NHS numbers were sometimes faded and you couldn't read all the numbers. Getting access to ward managers was difficult, and we knew how stressed they and everyone else was with COVID. It was difficult to scope then, but we managed. So we scoped each area prior to implementation. We looked at who needed the training, where to train and where best to train, and then it all began. We initially started in areas where patients would need 2 samples. So there were areas like pre-assessment, A&E, paediatrics, and we also had to train the phlebotomists pretty early on because they were the ones taking a lot of the bloods on the clinical areas. We then spent 6 weeks in each CSU, depending on its size. We went at different times of the day, towards depending on their workload. Found that after a week, most staff were trained on each ward, so we just keep on moving and leaving trainers to train others. The PDA and the printer were placed on the ward to use as soon as staff were trained. We didn't want there to be time for them to forget how to use it. The whole trust was trained in 6 months. We trained 2,862 staff, 30 clinical educators and 101 trainers. We had 1.6 whole-time equivalent transfusion practitioners, 1.2 whole-time equivalent extra help from our retired nurses. We worked 6 till 6 and sometimes later and some weekends. It was very tiring, but equally very satisfying when all areas were trained in the BloodTrack Tx system. So what went well? The ward team were easier to train because they were static. We left clinical educators and trainers on most wards. Some areas were difficult to train as surgical and medical wards didn't have staff that took blood due to their workload. Doctors took majority of the bloods and they were difficult to pin down. We could move quickly between CSUs and we had a motivated, committed training team, and hopefully we didn't spread COVID. The challenges. So the biggest overall challenge was our wristband printers. Obviously, as people know from previous presentations, you have to have the a wristband on in order to be able to use the system. They were always breaking in the clinical area, and you can't use TX if you haven't got a wristband. They took ages for IT to sort. This was flagged up at the assurance board to expedite faulty printers. Pre-assessment areas were the worst as they were working out of porter cabins due to COVID. It took IT months to sort because of the lack of Wi-Fi, and IT were all working from home. We couldn't get response for our patients in all outpatients. Outpatients do not generally send patients for transfusion samples, so the written samples there were negligible. We had to fit in and could be waiting around for staff to attend if it was busy where we were. Doctors were a nightmare to catch. We sent countless emails to Dr. Leeds in each speciality. They don't speak to each other. They don't read emails. Doctors would constantly say that they didn't know about it. Senior doctors could be very critical, not another electronic device that never works. Breaking the handwritten culture of handwritten samples was difficult. We captured FY1s in their induction and they were a dream. They didn't know anything different. We found areas that we didn't even know existed, so had to do further scoping. High-risk COVID areas like ICU, we just couldn't get on to do the training. So we trained clinical educators and staff outside of ICU, and then they went on to do the training. We gave them a general COVID card so they weren't allowed, because they weren't allowed their ID badges, and if they did have ID badges on, they were underneath the PPE. We wanted to use the NHS numbers and not have a barcode on the label, because that's originally how it presented. Because the number was at the top of the label, it was faded and you couldn't read it. Zebra came in and looked at every printer for us and made them more legible. We now have Zebra cleaning equipment to use. Staff would forget their ID badges because they had taken them to Morrison's to get their 10% off. Training bank staff, locums and medical students needed identifying as they weren't part of the ward team. Label rules and equipment and where they got them from was a challenge. We decided to keep label rules and charge the CSU for them as they came in really, really big boxes, and some of the wards only perhaps use that one label roll a year. We kept spare equipment in the lab to swap out of hours, and in hours we would go to the clinical area and sort the problem out. Equipment would also go missing, and we had to try and find it. We developed a sixth sense on where it would be. The generic leads would even go missing. I labelled these with red tape so I could spot them a mile off when being used in another piece of electrical equipment. The little solutions made all the difference. So actions. All right, what did we do about the challenges that we've met? We sent many ways of communicating as possible, all right, to the trust for everyone that wasn't trained to get the training. This was especially aimed at the doctors, as these were the worst offenders. We set up 2 drop-in sessions for training each week at the 2 major hospitals and circulated this to everyone. We went to the peripheral sites approximately every 6 weeks and trained staff on the wards as needed. We still run the drop-in sessions today, but only 1 a week now. We audited written samples each day to highlight the problematic areas. This went to the Assurance Board monthly, and they actioned it with medical directors and heads of nursing for each CSU. It's taken a while, but BloodTrack Tx is now embedded in medical student training, and we attend the medical hub to train along with the facilitators every 3 to 4 months. Bank staff attend the drop-in sessions and they action anyone not using the BloodTrack system. Locum doctors now have training on induction or are encouraged to attend the drop-in sessions. We check every piece of equipment in every area every 2 weeks. This is documented so we can see if there's a general trend in that area for equipment going missing or not being put back on charge. It also means we can keep an up-to-date inventory on all our equipment. Checks of the equipment are now on the daily ward checklist set by corporate nursing and is mandatory. They check to make sure the equipment is charged, where it should be, able to turn it on, and if there are spare labels. This can be done by anyone in the ward team. We are available in hours to action any problems, and the lab are pretty good at letting us know as well. One of the problems that is still not solved is samples come into the lab with the wrong pass number, or EPR, as some hospitals will know. If it's not the LTHT pass number, then the sample will be rejected. So the label will print the patient details with the pass number for or whatever's on that wristband. All wristbands in the Yorkshire region, all right, use PAS, and they are identical. The hospital name is not on the wristband. And if the wristband is not removed on transfers in from other hospitals to the clinical area and an LTHT one put on, then this is where mistakes happen. Part of the training is to complete the request form before going to the patient with the LTHT pass number on the form. They can then check the pass number on the wristband to make sure it's an LTHT one. And if it isn't, then remove it. Staff forget to check, regardless of how many times we tell them. We found labels being pre-printed in the middle of the night, ready for C-sections to be done the next day. Equipment was not put back on charge once it had been used. We even found equipment unplugged at Christmas, so the sockets could accommodate the fairy lights. It has got better though. Staff are still handwriting because they know that they can. The trust would not commit to zero tolerance until the risks have been looked at. I was very keen to go to zero tolerance, and I'm very jealous of Julie in Oxford. The trust said to pilot a few areas first, then to evaluate. So I decided that we'd pilot 3 areas. So we piloted 2 wards and 1 A&E department. So this was set to run for a week, and all written samples would be investigated. It was running well, or so I thought. A written sample came down from A&E. I went up to investigate. Staff told me it was really difficult as doctors were constantly asking them to print labels off for them or asking to borrow their cards, their ID badges, as they weren't trained. They said it was hard work, as they also ended up doing all the samples if they didn't, and they had enough work to do. I, of course, stopped the pilot. I just felt it was very unsafe and couldn't be assured that all labels were being printed off by the person taking the blood. Blood Bank checked all blood that had been administered on a sample that had come from A&E during the pilot. No one had received their own blood. From this, we focused education in the emergency department on why it was unsafe to print labels for a patient that you haven't taken blood on. We developed champions as well to challenge practice. Because of this, the trust said they would not commit to zero tolerance. So where are we now? We're still doing very well. That's how I think we are. I don't think we're ever going to be 100% while we're not committed to zero tolerance. But 93% of the trust use BloodTrack Tx. We audit written samples daily and follow up on them. We have embedded a new culture and lots of staff now don't know anything else. We have a reduction in rejected samples. And we have minimal problems in the clinical area. We have just had 2 recent rumbles and chews with BloodTrack Tx. Luckily, we knew their blood group. It might have been a different story if we hadn't, and we had issued blood on that one sample. We are now going to introduce the 2-sample rule, even with a BloodTrack Tx sample. This is also largely due to a new LIMS system coming into West Yorkshire this year. The system will only accept 2 samples to issue blood. We, however, think it's safer all round to go with a 2-sample route there. Cara Manning, a biomedical scientist, and Stephanie Ferguson, another Leeds TP, conducted a quality improvement project in 2021 and found that there were 53% less rejected samples than the previous year, which we thought was a definite improvement. So we've come a long way. We have come a long way. The electronic blood tracking system has been a success and evaluated really well. I am happy where we are at present till it all starts again this year when we start to introduce the haemobanks and administration, but looking forward to it at the same time. Thank you for listening.